It is really great to have you here. It's not often that we get so many Blue Food people in one place. And it has been 6 years since we did that at Stanford. So we are very happy to have you back on campus and to have a chance to be together outside our Zoom squares. So thank you, all of you, for coming. And I want to in particular thank Joshina and Andrea, who have made this event happen. So please, thank you. I think you've met them both, but they are the ones who have all the answers. So, and a lot goes into pulling off something like this. So I want to start there. It has been 6 years since we met here and set a lot of work in motion. And so I thought maybe I would use these minutes to take us back through a bit of that history, because it is context for the work we're now setting out to do together. Hi, Roz. I'm going to start with you two. So 2017, Theo McKaylee and I took over as directors of the Center for Ocean Solutions. And one of the things that struck us is that for all the research being done on fisheries and aquaculture, it was largely disconnected from all the work being done on food and agriculture. And so we enlisted Roz first as the obvious place to build a bridge between those two worlds, and Pam Matson, who was then the dean of the School of Earth Sciences. And together, brought together scholars from across those domains, from leading scholars in fisheries and aquaculture, people like William Chung and Zling Chao and Steve Gaines, and leading scholars from the world of food and agriculture, like Mario Herrera from Cornell, like Roz, like Pam. Really to begin to look at how could we begin to develop a research agenda that brought those two worlds together, that looked at how fisheries and aquaculture could be thought of, considered, explored within the context of food system programs and policy. At the same time, and so that was importantly, the beginning of a collaboration with Springer Nature. They sent 4 editors to the first meeting in January 2019, and that began the conversations about how we could work together to elevate these issues and elevate research on these issues. And it led pretty quickly to a collaboration with the University of Stockholm and a follow-on meeting 6 months later in Stockholm in June of 2019. In parallel, the World Economic Forum had convened something called the Friends of Ocean Action, and the Friends of Ocean Action brought together initially 50 ocean leaders from around the world, and part of what came out of that was a policy conversation about not only is there a gap or a division between these two worlds in research, they're also divided in policy. And all the global discussions about the future of food systems, how do we feed a world of 10 billion people within the limits of this planet, were discussions about crops and livestock. And so out of the Friends of Ocean Action, a discussion between us and the FAO and EAT and others, came the idea that we need on the policy side to engage that divide. And the result was the Blue Food Assessment. So the Blue Food Assessment, designed as the first concerted effort to understand the role of blue foods in food systems and to bring that into the policy world. So specifically keyed to the UN Food Systems Summit, which would be 2 years later, as an opportunity to elevate these issues. It was done, chaired by Bea Krona and by Roz. It was initially these 9 papers, and I'm happy to say we got 8 of them, which is pretty good, especially since COVID hit the month after our kickoff meeting. And 5 of those papers, despite the challenges of COVID for us and for peer review, 5 of those papers were published a week before the summit. In Nature, one of them on the cover, Jessica's paper on the cover, with an editorial, with a podcast, with a website devoted, on the Nature site, devoted to elevating blue foods. And that, of course, was accompanied by our own report, which is here's what this means for decision makers. So all those pieces were part of bringing blue foods into the heart of scientific discussions, but also discussions about food policy. Several things came out of that, and I'm not going to take you very deep into these, but just to give you a sense of the scope. One thread that runs through all the papers in the Blue Food Assessment is the extraordinary diversity of this resource. And for many people that was well known, but for many others it was brand new. As I like to say, there is one species of chicken raised all over the world. There are several thousand species of blue foods raised or harvested for food. And that diversity creates all sorts of possibilities, not least for resilience. Then in papers, is Chris here yet? Okay. In paper led by Chris and Zach and several others in this room, the first paper was on nutrition. and really helping people realize that many blue foods are superfoods, rich in many nutrients that are vital for healthy development. This is my favorite example. This little fish raised in fish ponds across Bangladesh accounts for 1/3 of the zinc, half the iron, and 98% of the vitamin A in the national diet. So really powerful resources for meeting nutrition challenges. A second is the recognition that blue foods can have a much lower footprint than terrestrial sources of protein. The paper that Jessica led, it illuminated that. It tells us that most of the blue foods that account for most of production are overall comparable to chicken, and many of them much better. And so there is, across that diversity, the opportunity to significantly lower the footprint of the food system. Demand, paper led by Roz with colleagues, gave us a first look into, okay, what are the forces, the factors that shape demand in culture and dietary preference and demographics and other factors that help us understand both how demand has grown and how we can expect it to grow in the future. And on the production side, spotlighting, something that people inside already knew, but people outside did not, that actually most of the food we eat is produced by small-scale producers, and they are incredibly diverse. Not as diverse as species, but very diverse in their circumstances, in their possibilities, in their constraints. And so really bringing to light that ecosystem of producers who are the heart of the system. Now, every food system has challenges, and I'm sorry to say that blue foods is not an exception to that. So one of them is climate. Paper that was led by William and Michelle Tickler from our team really looked at how is climate change going to ripple through these various blue food systems? What impacts can we expect it to have? And how well are governments positioned to actually deal with those impacts? So how can we begin to get a sense of resilience to climate change and what resilience needs to be built? In a paper led by Ling, the vulnerability of blue foods to environmental pressures of other kinds, plastic pollution, but also coastal pollution of various forms and other stresses to understand, okay, what needs to be addressed if we're going to have healthy blue food systems. And justice, a paper led by Christina Hicks and Jessica, which actually for me was both important and hopeful, which is to say, illuminating the challenges of justice across the system, that there are many marginalized populations, and especially consistently women, who are excluded from the benefits of the blue food system and often excluded from governance. Right? But that where governments had taken on those challenges, their policy actions had made a difference. So there were things one could do to begin to remedy that challenge in the blue food system. And finally, the synthesis led by Bea Krona, which pulled all this together and said, okay, what does this mean for decision makers? Given any set of national priorities, how can blue foods be relevant to what you do? And the most obvious single piece of that is that to the extent that you substitute fish for cows, there are big potential gains, both for health, heart disease, and so forth, and of course also for the climate. But all of that insight translated into decision-making form. So if you are a development policymaker, you think in these terms, you think in the SDGs. And the overall message of the Blue Food Assessment is blue foods are super relevant to your ability to achieve these goals. To put it a different way, the ambition of this work, and I think the impact of this work, has been to help decision makers at the highest level recognize that blue foods are actually important for what they're trying to accomplish. That blue food, it's an attempt to, and I think we are seeing success in, elevating from the fisheries ministers, who are always on the margins of power in the government, except for a few island states, to the finance ministers, food ministers, prime ministers, who have to deal with the core challenges of development. And this research is helping to bring these possibilities onto their table. Now, while all this science was being done, there was a very concerted effort to bring blue foods into the policy process. Many partners, core partners, were the Environmental Defense Fund, Carly is here, WWF, EAT, and the World Economic Forum. So intensive, collective, coordinated engagement with the summit process so that blue foods were prominent throughout. I have a whole separate presentation on that for those of you who really want to get down into the details, but a really important complement to the development of the science. And the result was that blue foods were prominent in the UN Food System Summit process. The chair of the summit and the UN Ocean Envoy together reached out to all the participants to emphasize the importance of featuring blue foods. They featured in presentations and in outcomes. One of the principal outcomes was the Aquatic Blue Food Coalition. Now 40 countries and many NGOs and academic institutions continuing to work together to elevate blue foods in international discussions. And one example of that is the UN Ocean Conference we had just last June. There were 9 plenary sessions on ocean action, and one of those 3-hour sessions was devoted to the blue food agenda. Now, many of you are doing exciting work on blue foods in many contexts. I'm going to just take one as an example, because it's the one we're working in, and I know more about it. So I want to just give you a sense, though, of the opportunities we're seeing for all this work to actually hit the water. And one opportunity is Indonesia, which by many measures is the most important, certainly one of the most important ocean nations on Earth. And after the Blue Food Assessment came out, Indonesia, the Ministry of Planning in Indonesia came to us and said, could you help us bring blue foods into our national development plan? And could you then help us develop a blue food assessment for Indonesia to guide implementation of that plan? And so our team here with many, many partners in Indonesia have been working with the Planning Ministry over the last 3 years to deliver on that ambition. And the opportunity is one you all would know well, which is that diversity of blue foods translates into huge diversity in both in terms of their nutritional opportunities they present and in terms of their footprint. So if you look across the hundreds of species that are produced for food in Indonesia, they each represent a very different set of possibilities for reducing the footprint of the food system and for addressing nutrition challenges. And so a national level blue food assessment allows you to get at that in a very granular way, in a way that's simply not possible at a global level. So the Blue Food Assessment of Indonesia was published in August of last year. We can give you the link. If you go through the Blue Food website, you will find the link. It is the work of many researchers from across Indonesia and other institutional partners, but it is a product of the Ministry of Development Planning, which is important, I think, to its position in the government. And just to give you a couple of examples from Zach's work of what this kind of analysis allows. So from the data that we were able to get from the government and that Zach was able to work with, we have information on the species produced and consumed in every one of the 500 districts across the country, combined with nutrition data that allows us to say a lot about the opportunities blue food represents in each of those places. We have granular information about the nutrient content of every species commonly consumed. This is only half the table. It also has aquaculture and preserved fish, but then you couldn't read it. But what you can see from this is that if you compare blue foods to the terrestrial sources of protein in gold, blue foods are just much, much better on a whole bunch of things that matter, right? And this brings to life the nutritional potential that we've been highlighting over the last several years, but in the specific context of this country. And in the process, you're also able to begin to get a window into cost. Obviously, prices vary across a country as vast as Indonesia, but this tells you that all blue foods are less expensive than beef. Surprise, surprise. But also many of them less expensive than chicken. So as a source of animal protein, actually quite competitive in this context. Now, this is the end. So the Blue Food Assessment published in August. In the meantime, a new president takes office, and the new president decides that cracking nutrition is his core domestic priority. So he sets in motion a program that aims to provide free meals to 82 million people every day. Right? That's 62 million school children and another 20 million mothers and infants. They're already at 60 million people implementing this program. You can imagine moving at that pace. There have been lots of challenges in this program. But at the same time, there's an ambition here that is, of course, vitally important for a country in the situation of Indonesia, and which they see as clearly centrally important to their ambitions to become a high-income nation by 2045. So this program, feeding 62 million school children every day, is of course centered on nutrition. And what we see now is the government saying, all right, so how can Blue Foods help us meet the goals of this program? It can't just be chicken and eggs, right? How can we bring Blue Foods into this program? And the planning ministry has come back and said, okay, how do we figure out how we can do the things that the Blue Food Assessment said are so important? How can we make sure, how can we look at the small-scale fishery sector, small-scale aquaculture sectors, which are here, as in other places, the heart of the blue food economy? How can we look at those sectors and figure out how we can source blue food from those producers in a way that improves their livelihoods, provides better nutrition to their children, and actually creates incentives for better stewardship of coastal resources? Now, that's a pretty tough set of questions, but it's the right set of questions and fundamentally important to realizing the aspirations of the work we set out on 6 years ago. And so that's the work that now lies ahead, and we are very eager for anyone who wants to be engaged in that because the possibilities are, of course, huge. So, what now? I should try and give you an overview of the research to be done that lies ahead. There is so much, right, to be done. So let me just highlight two things that run through these 2 days. So one is the need to continue to deepen our understanding of the sector. It's a complicated sector, right? I mean, there's a lot to figure out. And the work that we will be doing here over these 2 days on understanding, well, that we'll hear about shortly, about understanding coastal fishing communities more deeply than we do now, but also understanding then how those coastal communities, how small-scale fishers interact with the world of trade in a commodity that is the most traded food commodity in the world, fundamentally important to finding ways to really make progress here. And similarly, how do we help countries like Indonesia, but hopefully many others, actually embrace this agenda and take it forward? So what can we learn from those who are starting on that path? And how can we develop insights that help countries actually do what can be done in a way that improves their food system, but also sustains these resources for the longer term? So that's where we are. This is Blue Food Futures. There's a QR code. It'll take you straight to the website. Very proud of that. But this is what the Blue Food Futures program is all about, is how do we actually come together around the challenges that lie ahead and help governments actually meet them. And it is this partnership with that mission, but this meeting is a really important milestone in that effort. Thank you.